Welcome everybody to the NENA Housing Week for 2022. Today's session is Creative Ownership and Tenure Options for Australian Housing, and we're joined today by Jasmine Palmer, Sidsel Grimstad and Carl Fitzgerald. And I'll get them to introduce themselves as they come on to share their presentations with us. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I'm on, the Wurundjeri, Woiwurrung, Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I'm in Naarm in Melbourne, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and that it's very challenging to talk about housing and ownership and tenure in that context. And certainly the work that we do through Co-Housing Australia is deeply concerned with those issues, but also the aspiration that reconciliation can happen through creating more appropriate ways to live together and to live on this country more successfully, and to care for each other and that country. If we have a bit of a tradition of popping the name of our country into the chat, so I welcome anyone who would like to do that to please do so. And I'd also like to acknowledge the climate and biodiversity emergency as the other context in which we have this conversation. So today we're going to kick off with Jasmine. So if you want to bring up your presentation.
Welcome everyone. Thanks, Elena, for inviting all of us to speak today. I'm coming to you from Naarm in Melbourne. And my topic today that I've been asked to speak on was the alternative home ownership models in Australia. And I've tagged on a little bit on the end there that says an overview of current practices. Now, in deciding, what that title would be, I was tossing up a few different P words to put on the end there, because I don't think practices quite covers it. I think we're going to see today that there's a whole range of processes, programs, products and projects that all cause a degree of confusion in this area. And I hope that by looking into them in some detail, we can start to pull them apart. I just want to start today by mentioning that the work I'm presenting today is not quite published yet. It's just in completion. So this is a draft, and I ask for it to be seen as such, and not to have any of the images or anything, the diagrams cited, because they're still in draft. So what is the context in which we're discussing things today? Well, the access to secure and affordable housing is increasingly unavailable for many Australian households. High purchase prices, high rental prices, lack of dwelling diversity, low quality design and poor construction have motivated households and industry professionals both to navigate alternative pathways to achieving housing outcomes. In proposing these alternative pathways that we're going to look at today, or alternative ownership models, there's a whole bunch of existing challenges that we're facing. Of course, one of the primary ones that we need to deal with in terms of alternative tenure and financial and ownership models is this challenge we face around the increasing financialisation of housing, its perception as a source of wealth. And this has an impact on all tenures. It's not just about purchase price. Of course, it comes through to renting and rental prices as well. So what are we seeking in this regard? I think we need to seek a divergence from the dominant housing markets and systems. And that's a very big point and a very big ask. So other challenges we face, the increasing inequity that we see in housing, increasing inability to get into the market, increasing lack of mobility. I think it's interesting that a research project in 2017 pointed out that the Bank of Mum and Dad, as we call it, is now the 5th biggest lender in Australia. And it might be bigger than that now because that was 2017. So it's a significant contributor to how we manage and finance things that are going on. So how do we make that system more equitable? Another motivation I think we need to deal with is the mismatch in housing. So Essentially, our households, as one example of the mismatch, our households in Australia have been gradually diminishing in size for an extended period of time, while at the same time our new dwelling construction sizes are going up. We also have an increase in different types of dwelling households, which means that the demographic we're now seeking to house is not necessarily suitably housed by the existing housing that we have. So in reaction to these kinds of challenges, innovations around the country are producing both physical housing outcomes and raising community awareness of the potential benefits of challenging the status quo of housing provision and consumption. Some have been grassroots and others a bit more top-down. To achieve their objectives, each innovative home ownership model necessarily negotiates a unique pathway through the complex processes of housing provision, financing, ownership, and tenure. Like their international contemporaries, each emerging Australian model evolves to address the particular shortcomings of the status quo, to address the things that spurred their creation, the dissatisfaction with the existing market. Despite distinctive nuances, the emergent innovative models are frequently conflated. This is particularly true for those receiving public attention through online forums and social media platforms, where terms such as affordable, sustainable, community, and resilient are featured in discussions without definition. This misrepresentation leads to subsequent misunderstanding of innovative models, and that can impact their success over time. And it poses questions regarding how success is best measured. So it's in that context that I've been undertaking over the past year a research project that's looking at emergent innovative home ownership models and asking how do they enable access to more secure and affordable housing for Australian households. You can see here the sub-questions that looks at. So basically what it's trying to do is to take an inventory or an overview of what's happening in Australia at the moment. What are people proposing at the moment? What's actually getting out of the ground, because they're not necessarily the same thing. And how, fundamentally, how do they differ from conventional ownership pathways and from each other? Okay, so how has that been progressive? Well, I've done a bit of a national search of what sort of things are going on and different things that people are proposing. Basically, it's identified 25 unique examples. Some of them have other examples that are very similar to them, but there's 25 that are distinctly different. About a third have been initiated by industry professionals. About a third initiated by not-for-profit organisations. And the other third by community and resident groups. There's also involvement from an industry organisation in one case and a government agency in two other cases. So about 25 in total. So Victoria has witnessed the most active cluster of innovative models, including developments by resident collectives, such as property collectives and proposed by Urbau. Apartments for long-term rent as pathways to ownership, such as Assemble Housing, now called Assemble Futures. Non-speculative development, such as Nightingale Housing. And deliberatively designed co-housing, such as Urban Coop, where I live, and which I'll mention shortly. A second cluster is also strengthening in Western Australia, including co-housing projects and cooperatives, professional-led and government-supported building groups, and self-initiated deliberative developments. Resident groups and professionals alike are pursuing options in New South Wales, Adelaide, Brisbane, and Tasmania. So this survey, although there is a focus definitely on what is occurring in Melbourne and Perth and ACT to some extent, there is also cases occurring elsewhere which can be compared and contrasted, which we're in the process of doing. So what's happened then? We've identified these 25 different housing models that are existing or proposed, kind of grouped them. We've grouped them by how they differ or where they seek to innovate. So essentially, many of them provide an alternative financial route. Some provide a slightly alternative tenure. Very few provide alternative titling, and a fair proportion propose an alternative approach to producing dwellings. So as we go through, you'll see those logos on the examples and you can sort of identify how they're varying with each of those. So alternative financing is the first one we'll talk about. As barriers to entering or re-entering home ownership increase, an obvious point of system intervention is to support purchasers into the market via financial processes and programs. This has been a common feature of government policy and intervention, including the First Homeowners Grant and First Home Loan Deposit Scheme, which lowering lenders' mortgage insurance through the New Home Guarantee and the Family Home Guarantee, and reducing loan repayments through things like shared equity. The survey of current innovations in Australian home ownership undertaken identified 3 distinct types of alternative financing, being joint ownership, shared equity, and delayed purchase. Familial funding, or the bank of mum and dad, is not specifically addressed here. However, it's worth noting that familial funding can occur across all of those 3 types. So one approach to alternative funding is this notion of sharing, an out there notion. So ideas of joint ownership, where people in non-familial relationships are sharing property ownership. So this lowers the initial ongoing cost of home ownership to own and occupy the property jointly with another individual or another household. Sharing property requires careful consideration of the obligations and responsibilities, as well as a commitment to managing the property and relationships for the duration of ownership. Joint ownership of a sole property title as tenants in common has a long established legal history in Australia. And owning property with another party, be they family, friends or strangers, involves an intertwining of property rights and requires agreements and detailed processes for management, cost sharing and resale procedures. As property prices have escalated, there's been an anecdotal increase in the number of individuals and households willing to consider entering joint ownership as a necessary compromise to achieve housing security and enter home ownership. In response, financial and legal services experienced in joint ownership have made their services more accessible through marketing and provision of services. For example, the Commonwealth Bank has recently repackaged some of their loans to essentially remarket them to identify how they can be used in this property sharing manner. And another response has been an increase in joint ownership through the emergence of PropTech. PropTech services such as mortgage mates are essentially working as a dating agency for people to find each other to then go and enter joint ownership together and assist and guide them through the process, making them aware of the downfalls they might encounter and ways of dealing with those. So sharing ownership is a process one can embark on. The funders and the PropTech organisations like Mortgage Mates are showing willing participants a viable pathway. Shared ownership operates within the existing housing market, with the CommBank product explicitly excluding construction finance. So you can only buy something that already exists. So hence they do not encourage innovation in housing products. They do not increase dwelling diversity or diverge from the dominant market system. That sounds negative. That sounds like I'm concluding on all the things it doesn't do, but we learn from the things that things don't achieve. Another example in the finance model is shared equity, which we've probably all heard a bit about, considering its relevance in politics and in the pre-election campaigning, etc. this year. Government programs at state and federal levels have recognised the difficulties experienced by first home buyers to save sufficient funds for house deposits and to service mortgages for market price dwellings. A response to that is shared equity ownership, which facilitates access to home ownership for households otherwise excluded by allowing them to purchase less than 100% of their property. So that requires a lower deposit and lower mortgage repayments while maintaining most of the rights typically associated with home ownership. Shared equity agreements differ state by state, but they do generally include a time parameter with the purchasing household ideally realising 100% equity over time. Commonly, although it can take different forms, the purchaser occupies the dwelling independently of the shared equity partner. So you haven't got someone allocated to share the house with you by the government. You own the property and you have sole use of it. You hold legal title of the property, and you can, as I said, realise 100% ownership over time. A common attribute of shared equity schemes across the country is that the occupier incurs 100% of ongoing property costs. So the government might technically own maybe 30, 25, in some cases 35% of your dwelling, but you incur all the costs of maintaining and keeping that dwelling, even though they own that piece of equity. And this clearly distinguishes them from the previously discussed joint ownership models. So almost every jurisdiction in Australia has a shared equity model, with the exception of New South Wales. But of course, we're having one proposed to come in the near future from a national level. But at this point, I can only talk about the state-based ones. So just as an example, this is the criteria for the Victorian model that was introduced not so long ago. But it's worth noting that having described shared ownership for this, and it's a process that you can enter into, and the new technologies and information guide you in that process. Shared equity is different to that. It's not really a process, it's what we would call a program. So here I am back to those P words. That is a program being defined as a set of related measures or activities with a long-term aim. So therefore, we need to ask, what is the aim? And the aim for the Victorian Fund, for example, is to make it easier for Victorians to enter home ownership. So I would argue that it doesn't therefore address any of the main challenges I outlined at the beginning, the challenges around increased financialisation, the challenges around being able to build properties that have less of a mismatch between, our increasing number of single-person households and our increasing number of three-bedroom houses. So it doesn't directly address those things. The programs also limit participation through eligibility criteria, and also, so hence, once you've selected to participate in these kinds of schemes, you're put under the constraints of an administering authority. It's very top-down. So these types of schemes assist eligible households to gain access to the market, but they do not intervene in the existing market-driven housing system, as I mentioned. And in fact, the scheme in Victoria says you can use it for a new build house. However, at the time of signing the contract, you have to have a certificate of occupancy. So you can't actually design and build the house you want or need to meet your own needs. And we know that part of the dwelling mismatch that occurs is simply the functional requirement of enough dwellings to meet the physical needs of people. And as we increasingly have challenges in that regard. The term shared equity can also be loosely used, so I've grouped it together with them, to describe the ACT land rent scheme. So in this example, the ACT government retains ownership of the land, charging annual rent at 2% of the unimproved land value. The intention, again, the aim here, is to enable households to save to purchase the land while they're paying the rent on the land. So it lowers the point, it lowers the bar for entering into ownership. It has been much debated over recent years, while interest rates have been so low that there was very little benefit to someone entering into this scheme because you could get a house mortgage at around 2%, you might as well have just bought the land. But of course, things change all the time, and we're now seeing much higher interest rates than that. So the effectiveness of this scheme comes back into play potentially. Like the Victorian shared equity scheme, eligibility is periodically reassessed. So if you enter into one of these land rent schemes where the government owns the land, you build a house on it that you own, and you pay rent to them for the land, and just say your income increases and you're no longer eligible for that, then the agreement is terminated. You need to transfer that land agreement to being a normal one, or you need to move out and the house is sold on to another eligible household. In this case, you are building a dwelling for yourself, which is not possible in Victoria because these are part of new land development schemes undertaken by the ACT Development Agency, whose name is not coming to mind right now. One housing product. So now I'm using the word product for my keyword. So a product being an article or substance that is manufactured or made, refined for sale. So I would describe these examples, the land rent communities, as a product, as opposed to the previous ACT land rent system, which was a program aiming to get you into full-term ownership. So what is the product that's become offered through land rent communities? Well, these are developments that are typically aimed at over 55s. They separate land ownership from ownership of the dwelling and improvements. So residents own their own dwelling and the improvements on the land, while a for-profit corporation owns the land, the services, the infrastructure, the shared amenities, and it charges you rent for that. Communities are in various locations and designed to meet the needs of a range of socioeconomic groups. So some of them are purely rental. Some of them people own their own dwelling in there for a set lease period of time. And the rent paid, because you're paying rent for the land and services, the rent paid is eligible for Commonwealth rent assistance. So this is where my cynical side comes in, and I say that hence in some cases, not all cases of this type of model, asset-rich retirees get government rent assistance to access luxury facilities, with for-profit corporations realising profit directly from the public purse. That's another project I think I need to do more detailed research into. But there's also not-for-profit examples of this where land and building ownership are separated, including community land trusts, which we'll hear about more later from Carl. So I won't go into community land trusts at this point. I do want to just flag that these shared equity arrangements are not just government. So we've got them in many, many states, and we've got the proposal for a new national one being refined, but there's also others. Both private investment funds, which are providing market returns to their investors while seeking to achieve a positive social outcome. So an example of those would be Wise Housing and Buy Assist, where they're getting people to invest money for the particular purpose of providing housing to people who need to access shared equity to get into the market and may or may not be eligible for the government models. And one of those targets specifically single women, single female-led households, I should say. And there's also some charitable organisations running shared equity programs that take a more altruistic intent. So I just wanted to mention one example of those, which is the Barnett model in Victoria. So this is encouraging people who are in long-term public housing to move into home ownership. So people whose incomes have risen and they're at the top of the rent scale for public housing, encouraging them to move out of that public housing to free it up for others in greater need. Now, how are they achieving this? Well, you've got to overcome a few barriers. One of the main barriers being that some of these older multi-generational public housing towers, for example, in Melbourne are in the inner north suburbs where people have developed their community and their lives, but there's no way that you could manage to afford to move out into those suburbs and access housing outside the public housing sector if you were on a relatively low income. So what the Barnett model does is it develops some dwellings in that area, within that community, so people can stay in their community, which the market itself wouldn't develop. So they're smaller, they're less high end, they're within the price point that people wanting to leave public housing can move into, but the market would never deliver them. They would use the land to do something much more high end to make more profit. So essentially the Barnett model is not only providing a shared equity which enables people to get into home ownership in the ways that the other models do, but it's delivering a product that's not currently on the market. So it is increasing that diversity and levelling equitable access to home ownership. All of these non-government ones have quite targeted demographics. So the Barnett model is that particular building we're looking at. You could only buy in there if you were long-term in public housing, living within a few kilometres of that new building within the North Melbourne public housing towers, essentially. So very limited demographic, but an important demographic. So one thing about these non-government schemes is they're very, very targeted. Oh, we're still on finance. So another financial intervention is around delayed purchase. Now, this is not to be confused with the old so-called dirty rent to buy, which was sort of extracting money from those at greatest risk or those who were unable to obtain commercial mortgages. This is a different agenda entirely. So this example here is Assemble Futures, which have in July this year, this building's been occupied. The image on the left is a computer model, not the real thing, so the garden hasn't grown that quickly. But essentially what's happening here is it's 72 apartments and people move into the apartment on a 5-year lease. So you've got more permanent tenure than you do in a normal rental situation in Australia. And at the end of that 5-year lease, you have the right to buy your dwelling at a price that was agreed when you moved in. So you can be planning to obtain the adequate deposits and financial arrangements to step into that while being in secure housing in that time. And again, I describe this one as a new product. And it's not the only delayed purchase program. There's some others just getting off the ground or in development. One is called Own Home, where a bunch of investors essentially put their money together and buy a house that you want for you to live in while you finish saving your deposit, and then you buy it off them. So it's a step up kind of system. It is, however, aimed at high income young professionals. So they have good incomes and no deposit. So there's a very limited demographic that's suitable for. And there's also another one in development, again in the ACT, but it's looking at a national plan, but it just happens to be starting in the ACT, to house female-headed households and provide them with a pathway to home ownership. So two very different models. So that was all the ones with the dollar sign on the left. Now we're moving into some of the ones that have this cog, which is, I'll just remind you, was sort of talking about how they differ in terms of production. And one example of this that is has been seen in multiple places over recent years is one of the case studies in the University of New South Wales Collaborative Housing website is the Shedders. So this is where 3 retired couples coming together, living in a single dwelling that's been designed to meet their needs, with a lot of communal support of each other occurring through the communal spaces that they've generated. So this is a process. This is an alternative process because they've gone about building themselves a dwelling, which has a completely different type of design to normal, and they're doing it with the objective of housing themselves. So they're just generating the one project. So we can learn this from this project. We can learn by sharing the experiences we have from others. But what we see with these kinds of projects is a challenge in their replicability, because people have done it to house themselves. And then once you're in that house, you're quite exhausted, and it's quite a challenge to share that information with others. So it's a great benefit that we do get so much information from the Shedders about their journey. But we're also seeing some examples like this elsewhere in Australia, where there is a bit of an intention to experience the process to realise your own project, then hopefully develop that into a future product that can be replicated by others. So being able to replicate that process. Again, there's always going to be limits as to who is able to enter into these kinds of processes, but this is an example in the ACT where 3 residences with a common house, so a very mini co-housing, is being put on a single block in Canberra in an area that would not normally be allowed to have multi-unit dwellings on that block. So it's outside of the typical planning zone, and it's being used as sort of an exemplar, a demonstration of the feasibility, and hopefully will have influence on ongoing planning legislation. So hopefully we'll see this process, which is realising a project, hopefully turn into a product. And similar thing happening in Western Australia, where there's a trial variation to the planning scheme known as the Frio alternative, where we're seeing another 4 dwelling mini co-housing project go up, hopefully with that degree of replicability moving forward. In this realm of, alternative ways of procuring housing, another group of cases is around resident-led multi-unit housing. Sorry, I'll rephrase that as it says on the slide, resident-developed multi-unit housing. So this is where residents are putting in the cash to develop for themselves. Again, it's a new process to negotiate, each project needing to negotiate a process that suits their individual needs to realise their own individual project. So, the happy people smiling on the slide here have been living in their hempcrete homes in Denmark, Western Australia for a few years now. And there's about 12 dwellings and a common house. So, that's an example of how you can come across different solutions, integrating co-housing, using the land in a different way. So it's the same density as the other dwellings around it, but has much more shared and communal spaces, doesn't have cars parked inside or next to houses. So you have much more access to veggie gardens, etc., that are all shared. Another resident developed multi-unit housing example where we see the process having been developed for a small project some years ago, and the people who did that now replicating it a number of times, now being up to Property Collective. I don't know if they're run by numbers, but about 12 or something, where essentially what they've done is converted that process into a product. So a group of people can now approach those professionals who can guide them through the process of realising a house for themselves through this resident developed multi-unit housing process known as Property Collectives. And they're also increasing in their, not only the number of individual collectives, but in the size of those collectives. So they're currently working on one which will integrate a lot of co-housing qualities, which is in Eltham in Melbourne. I'll mention this one. This one was not resident developed, but resident led. So resident led co-housing, where we, because I'm in this one, where we partnered together with a developer, and that developer was Nightingale Housing. So we're a group of 29 households now living in our co-housing building, which has about 20% of all the interior space. It's shared. So we have enormous, giant shared kitchen, multi-purpose room, guest rooms, music room, workshop, all sorts of things. And so I would describe that as a process and project, and I sort of emphasize to ourselves and in our own process of continually thinking about how do we help others do that as we move forward. So hopefully, some of the facilitation and sharing and dissemination of information through Co-Housing Australia will help that. But this is our new house. We've been here now since July, and bottom left corner is looking down on our rooftop garden on a hazy Saturday in Melbourne yesterday. This is our common dining room and the kitchen, where we have had multiple meals for sort of 60 people. So we've seen that there's different ways in which projects can vary from the status quo. So we looked at them in terms of financing, tenure, titling and production. Haven't really gone into titling at this point. And then describing those as whether they're process, program, product or project. I know there's lots of P's and O's in there, but I've been finding it useful to differentiate between the different schemes and the different models to see what different things they're achieving. Again, this is draft. So this will be refined and published in due course. So then I began to think, well, how do we understand this further beyond those different P's? So if Birkenholz, more than 10 years ago, gave us a very detailed outline of what is the subsystems of housing production in Australia. It helps us understand how we produce, exchange and consume housing, and how we do that under an overarching management subsystem. And I always find that a useful tool to understand what's going on. How do these things vary in terms of production, exchange, consumption and management? More recently, we also have from Pawson, Lawson et al. a breakdown of how they see government policy action happening in housing. So we have housing policy as government actions or policy settings that influence the supply of dwellings and its spatial distribution, the characteristics of management of housing stock, and who gets access to them. So all of these areas that Burke and Holtz identify are also influenced by housing policy as described by Pawson. Now, that's the general housing systems. So when we're thinking more about self-organised housing provision, we can learn from Crabtree, and Louise is speaking, I think, later tonight or later in the week, where she identified ways in which self-organised housing provision in Australia diverged from the dominant systems. And so using that as a cue, this project develops what you might call a taxonomy, where it looks at 9 different ways that alternative home ownership models can deviate from the status quo. So here they are down here. So they're within the production, exchange and consumption subsystems, and they deal with things around project initiation. Who starts building the housing? Design. Who decides what sort of functional and design requirements are set out? Development finance, as distinct from financing ownership, which is in the next section, exchange. So in exchange, we have property title, how gains and returns are dealt with, and financing ownership. And in consumption, we have the bundle of rights, tenure, and management in use. So basically what this project's doing is taking those 9 points and identifying how each of the different projects, which vary in tenure, etc., differentiate from status quo in those 9 points. So what has it found by looking at all of those 25 examples through this taxonomy? It's found that innovation occurs in financing, tenure, property titling and production, but seldom in more than one of these, normally just in one. Intended innovations are frequently thwarted by existing system constraints, particularly in relation to innovative tenures, which defy the owner-renter dichotomy, which there's some examples that develop that thought. Finance innovations and examples which modify processes are limited to supporting the current housing market. So finance things don't really innovate to any great extent. And innovations leading to the development of new products are replicable and have potential for long-lasting system change, in contrast to things that are just processes, programs, or projects. Innovations in titling and production are most likely to lead to systemic change, although innovative property titling proposals face a high degree of resistance. This framework for describing alternative ownership models can be useful to avoid the conflation of distinctly different models, and in understanding whether the intervention is truly intervening in the problematic status quo to achieve desirable outcomes for more people, or if it's merely rearranging the deck chairs. So what we've identified here at the very bottom, which will lead us on to the next presenters, is this question of titling, which I didn't speak about in detail, but here we see community land trusts and lend-lease communities and cooperatively owned co-housing down here as things which do bridge all those 3 spheres of influence and have the potential to have the greatest change. So on that note, I hand over to the subsequent speakers who are taking us through those 2 particular topics. Thank you.
Great, wonderful. Thanks, Jasmine. That's perfect setup. I'll hand straight over to Carl.
Oh, I can see you now. Oh, hello, everyone.
Yes, well done, Jasmine. And hello all, here from the lands of the Dja Dja Wurrung in central Victoria. My name's Carl Fitzgerald, and today we're celebrating 3 months of Grounded being in operation. So yeah, it's a new NGO that we've set up to, I'm just going to press share screen. There's our brand new logo, big and bold. So Grounded, a non-profit organisation to advocate, incubate and accelerate CLTs. And yeah, we're excited because for the last 18 odd years I've worked at Prosper Australia, where I've been able to talk about CLTs here and there, but haven't been able to dedicate my time to the importance of the project. So I was very lucky to find some funding from a local philanthropist to set this NGO up, and yeah, bumped into my unpublished report from Prosper from probably 10 years ago talking about CLTs. So yeah, it's been fantastic this first 3 months, and a lot of good things are coming together. So the advantage of CLTs is we can hold land and housing in trust to enhance flexibility, affordability, and good old financial freedom. And yeah, I'm passionate about CLTs because I feel that our land and housing payments should be a valuable community resource that we can all benefit from. If you think about the rising value of location, it should be seen as one of the most powerful renewable resources we all have at our fingertips. So yeah, part of our job at Grounded is to really try and help people understand what CLTs are, and so good old infographics come to the fore. This first one is describing the CLT classic model. And community land trusts are so powerful because we're actually pulling the land out of this speculative market that seems to reflect quite literally a property owning democracy. We need to reserve the locations we can for perpetual affordability. And that's one of the big advantages of CLTs, is that the trust is set up to govern this land to ensure that it's perpetually affordable. Now, there are a number of different models that can be undertaken to deliver on that process, depending on which state you live in. I'm not going to go through all that in great detail today. This is really just an overview type presentation. But this is the difference between the current housing story and the CLT story, where we all know it. Investors come in, buy up properties, and both rents and prices increase. Each time that property is sold, that money leaves the community. I think it's a really interesting way we should start analysing housing, is how much money actually leaves and heads into the deep pockets of the well-connected, rather than staying within that community and acting as a force for resilience and protection of that community. And so, as we're seeing increasingly, people are displaced, and yeah, government waiting lists for public housing, as we all know, are blowing out. So all advocates of the community land trust really see it as a powerful mid-step between the private property market and sort of public and social housing. So yeah, with the government's recent announcement for 1 million homes, we're hoping that the CLT model can receive some government support to get up and running. In the last 5 or 6 years in the UK, the Community Housing Fund there has enabled some £300 million to assist the CLT movement, and that's something that Grounded is working towards, so that the various community working groups out there can access some much needed funding to push things along. So the CLT land trust story, I'm trying to spell it out with this bottom infographic here, where the resident owns the home, CLT owns the land. A resale formula aims to keep a cap on prices, which ensures affordability over time. At its most basic level, a CLT should ensure that both deposits and mortgage repayments are reduced by some 30%. And this is where this resilience aspect comes through with the CLT, that those funds are used to pay down the trust debts and in time expand the base for affordable housing. Now, before CLTs came to our attention in the sort of early 70s type era, there were land rent communities that went back to the early 1900s, and many of those, there's a couple of prominent ones, one in particular, Arden, Delaware, where they managed to pay off their debts within the first decade, and then after that became rather well known as a nudist art colony. And yeah, I feel like we can learn a lot from this history and ensure that within the objects of a CLT constitution, we're advocating for one of the key objects is to expand the base for affordable housing so that the trust lives up to that promise and continues to provide housing for future generations on an expanded basis. So some jurisdictions allow the split between land and housing, in particular the ACT. Here in Victoria, with the 2017 Residential Tenancies Act amendments, there has been improvements to that. Hasn't been tested fully though, and that's something we're working towards. But this next infographic kind of explains what that would be about. So we have someone on the left who buys in. The trust could set a entrance price cap at 70% of the market value in that region. And when during the time they stay there, they pay a leasehold for the land to the trust. But when they sell, the profit is shared. And there's all sorts of different formulas on how that profit is shared. But generally, as an overview, we can see that the funds can be used to build more homes. And then as time goes on, community wellbeing grows. So yeah, it's been phenomenal to see what's happened in the UK with this community housing fund. In particular, the last 15 odd years there, things have really taken off. And yeah, when CLTs receive donated land, they've been shown to deliver a benefit of 1.8 for every $1 invested, which is pretty phenomenal. And this rises to $2.70 for every $1 invested when health, well-being, and income distribution benefits are factored in. And then in the long run, that increases up to 3.1 to $1. So these are incredible returns for a housing model where, Jasmine showed us some incredible variety of funds, of models that are out there, but I'd just like to bring to your attention this very subtle change that's happened in policy. It's almost like governments at all levels have raised the white flag and said housing affordability is no longer possible. We're going to start using a term called housing accessibility. So that's what we see with most of these shared equity programs, particularly those that offer government incentivized deposits. This really is just helping keep the treadmill moving and not dealing with the underlying fundamentals. So that's where the CLT can really play a part, because it has that legal drive to deliver affordable housing, has the resale cap, so prices are limited to 70% of the median. Some trusts may well be able to get the numbers to reduce that down to 50% of the median. Yeah, with medians at 1.1 in Sydney and similar down here in Melbourne. Yeah, 700,000 is still way too costly. But one of the things I like about CLTs is that it can help to reduce that deposit gap to get into the market. And the combination of that and the resale formula ensures that this deposit incentive the deposit incentive doesn't lead to inflationary prices in the long run. And that's certainly something that we need to keep in mind with so much drive to deal with the housing quagmire. We must make sure that the millions and billions in government support are not actually making the problem worse. So yeah, just to finish off, we are launching Grounded on the 22nd of November at the Queen Victoria Women's Centre. Love to see anyone who's been a supporter of CLTs or who is interested in the concept in person. There will be a hybrid stream there as well for those who are interstate. And lastly, the website, it's a holding page at the moment, but we'll be going live in the next week. All right, Elena, there you go. Just about on time.
Great, fabulous. And can't wait to see the nudist artist colony on the cover of your government brochure that you send through to them to get some of their funding. I'll hand it straight over to you, Sid, so we'll keep it rolling.
Thank you, Elena. I'll try to share some of my slides as well.
While you bring that up, I'll just offer for people to pop your questions in the chat, especially as we're going and as they come to you, and then I can call on you when we reach Q&A. Thank you.
Okay, so hello everybody. I'm talking from Newcastle on the east coast of Australia. But as you can hear, my background is Norwegian, and cooperative housing, or housing cooperatives rather, which is a point I'm making, is a very mainstream housing solution in Norway and in many other countries. And I've lived in my first lived experience outside the family was in a housing co-op. My mother lives in a senior housing co-op, my brothers, and so on. So this is quite mainstream solution in Norway. And so this talk is about, first of all, why housing co-ops, and then I'm going to look a little bit about housing co-op sectors elsewhere. And then last, I'll talk about a research project and an ARC linkage research project, which I'm involved in, which does research on articulating value in housing co-ops in Australia. So not elsewhere, so here. I was incredibly impressed by Jasmine's presentation and the level of detail she has gone into the different, what should I say, sore points of housing models in Australia, because there really are many. Housing co-ops is one type of housing, but it's a particular legal model, legal and a shared ownership model, which is different to many of the other housing models. And it's an old housing system, I would call it, and it has been guided for 150 years. Maybe the started a long time ago. And they're guided by the 7 cooperative principles still today. And they are international principles where you have voluntary and open membership, you have democratic member control, members should participate in supporting the co-op, autonomy and independence is very important, education, training and information, Cooperation among co-ops is important, and concern for the community and the environment. So these are kind of general principles that govern all co-ops, including housing co-ops. So while Jasmine was talking about titling, and that's where the sticking point is in Australia, it's important to remember that co-ops is a particular tenure model, but we have different types of co-op housing. You have rental co-ops, you can have shared equity, full equity co-ops, and these offer different what should I say, levels of affordability, I would say. And in different countries, you have different, you can have different percentage of rental or equity or shared equity models. So it's important to remember that co-op is a tenure model. When it comes to design, you can have all kinds of designs, and our research project on Australian housing co-ops show that as well. You can have many different types of designs. It is not necessarily a co-housing model, and that's important. I think most of the equity-based co-ops in Scandinavia are not co-housing models. They are just basically flats or houses where you kind of own your own unit, and you don't have a lot of co-housing features in it, amongst it. Yeah, but so I wanted to just quickly talk about why do you want to grow a co-op housing sector in Australia when it's not a very common model. But it is, of course, this national housing unaffordability crisis that is pushing for other ways of or other alternative models of affordable housing. And when we look to other countries, we can see that housing co-ops can be an affordable model. It's not necessarily so, but it can be an affordable housing model. It also, in other countries, provides a housing sector which is outside investment pressures. And Carl, you mentioned this issue, this process in the community land trust, which I think is quite similar to non-profit housing cooperative sectors, where you reinvest potential profits into the sector again. Secondly, the way we can make it a sector that's kind of outside investment pressures is that there are quite strict rules in housing co-ops that you have to live in the unit that you own or the house that you own. You cannot use it for investment purposes. So and that changes kind of the dynamic. So, for instance, Airbnbs are banned mostly in housing co-ops in Europe, exactly for that reason. You live in your housing unit, and that's it. So there's something about trying to get a housing sector that's outside the financialization pressures. I'm not saying all co-op models do that, but some do. Yes, but in Australia, and Jasmine, your research is amazing because you have looked at all these different models. So I wanted then to continue now to look at the big sectors in other countries, and then end with talking a little bit about our ARC linkage projects. And partly, but I guess I'm talking to the converted in a way in this forum, but there are so many myths about housing co-ops in Australia, you know, that we have a particular commune in mind when we talk about housing co-ops, but that's kind of not the case in other countries. Yeah. So what I wanted to show just briefly is this table where I've looked at different, looked at a few countries where housing cooperatives offer a prominent or is a prominent size of the housing stock, and Denmark is a very interesting case because they have such a large portion of rental cooperatives, which are affordable, which offer affordable housing. And it's 20% of the housing stock, which means that 1 in 5 Danish citizens or Danish resident lives in what we call rental cooperatives. What's interesting is that each of these co-ops are run by non-profit rental co-op providers, and they set aside a little bit of money from their rent to build up a national housing development fund. And so that, and they can also use that because they have started this sector a long time ago. They now have a national housing development fund, which also it acts as a guarantor for commercial loans to construct new rental co-ops. So this is a big, it's like a sovereign wealth fund for housing. And it's similar to Carl's small model of a community land trust, but it's in a very big scale. What's also prominent is that you have advocacy organizations that support co-op housing. They support management and support and educate members so that governance is not such a huge burden, and they can get help in how to manage their outside areas and so on. I think another element of co-op housing is that they are really homes for people. You have secure tenure in these rental co-op flats, and it means that you can paint your flat and live in them as if they were your house, and or they are your home, so to speak, and there's a feeling of home. You also have what we call full equity co-ops in Denmark, and one of the reasons that Copenhagen is such a nice city to be in is that you can have full equity co-ops, you can have private housing and rental co-ops in the same block. So we don't have so much segregation between ownership types, and it creates a different urban environment. Sweden and Norway, they have full equity co-ops, so they in some senses operate just as private ownership. In Germany, we have rental co-ops as well, but also full equity co-ops. And then Australia. So the most prominent model of co-ops we have here is our rental co-ops, and they're less than maybe 1%, much less than 1% of the housing stock. What has happened in the later years is that, so we saw a big expanse of rental co-ops or affordable housing co-ops in the 90s, and primarily these are the ones that still remain active today, apart from some of the new ones that are coming just this last couple of years. And they have been kind of put under the umbrella of inside the community housing system. And so they have peak bodies in each of the states, and it is in this and it is among the housing cooperative sector in Australia that we have developed this research project called Articulating Value in Housing Cooperatives. And we want to understand more and in detail both the value of Australian housing co-ops and also the challenges that they are encountering, because we think that through knowing the Australian context and how they work in the Australian context, in a deep way, we can maybe also then find better solutions for the future of this model. So I just wanted to spend a few more minutes. I don't know how much time I got, but a few more minutes to talk about our research project. So we've got all the different community housing providers that are peak bodies for rental housing co-ops in Australia as our industry partners. So Common Equity Housing in South Australia, Corporation Housing in West Australia, Common Equity Housing Limited in Victoria, Common Equity Cooperative Housing in New South Wales, and United Housing Cooperative Limited in Victoria. So we've got all these as partners in our project. So we want to create an evidence base and identify how benefits are created, because, and I noticed that, Jasmine, you mentioned Pawson. So Pawson has developed in a way a model to assess how community housing providers offer housing, affordable housing in the most cost-effective way. And we want to say, not only maybe we want to prove or what should I say, add more facts to the statement whether cooperative housing actually provides an affordable housing model, which in addition provides added benefits, other social value and other social benefits. And it's the first time that we have managed to collect data from the housing cooperative sector in Australia. So we're collecting both time use surveys, calendar of annual events. We're going to see how much work the members do to contribute to the housing cooperative functioning well. We're looking at the quality of housing, and then we're going to have member surveys and member interviews. And it's quite exciting because this has been a project that's been going on for almost 3 years now. And we are finalizing our data collection, and results will be released in early next year. And that was my presentation. So I feel I'm shortcutting it a little bit because I can't say too much about the results yet. Thank you.
No problem. That was great. We definitely will have to get you back on when you've consolidated some of those results, because I think that will be really interesting. And by then, Jasmine might have published her paper as well. So, and Carl will have his government brochure ready to go. So sounds like we'll reconvene in the new year, I think, and see where we're at. Just looking in the chat for some questions, and anyone's welcome to come on to speaker as well and ask your question. Kiki's asked in the chat, how will your research help new potential housing co-ops?
It's a very good question, and we are definitely wanting to help new potential co-ops. There are issues related to housing co-ops who being under the community housing kind of sector, because it adds a lot of extra administrative work on the co-ops. On the other hand, that helps for affordability of co-ops. We are looking at how can you develop funding mechanisms that can provide building of new co-ops. And there's a lot of interest from especially member-owned financiers and ethical investors in this. But I think, again, there are issues around titling, as Jasmine was talking about. Banks and investors are not so keen on investing in cooperatives or collective owned property at the moment, and I think there are some legal barriers as well that we need to look into. Yeah, but certainly we are hoping to help in developing new co-ops for sure.
Jasmine, I was going to jump in and ask, happy to see there's an ethical development within PropTech. Mortgage mates, that sounded very interesting. Are there many other sort of public interest-based apps coming on board to help this community-led housing movement?
Internationally, more so would be the brief answer. But yeah, Mortgage Mates is interesting. I mean, they're trying to facilitate people coming together. It's a dating agency where they're sharing resources and links to the professionals you might need to seek guidance from. So who are lawyers who understand this? Who are lenders who understand what you're wanting to do when you're sharing ownership of a dwelling? Now, sharing ownership of a single, suburban house is nothing all that unusual. But this means of guiding people through the process to do something that is a little bit out of the norm is really valuable. And Mortgage Mates are extending into the UK. I'm not sure that they've actually paired together and helped that many households in Australia actually into dwellings at this point. I haven't spoken to Daisy from there for a number of months, so they might have now, but it's very fledgling. There's other sort of PropTech networking kind of things in Germany to assist people to come together for Baugruppe and link together with professionals, so building groups of apartments, and that's all really quite well developed. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah.
And I'll throw one back at you, Carl.
Good, right? Go on. Hit me.
So where do you get your land from?
Yeah, well, that is one of the most important things is timing. If you're going to buying at the bottom of the cycle, a lot of land trusts have come in trouble by buying at the wrong time in the property cycle. But yeah, we'd like to think that as more understanding and certainty develops around the CLT model, that ethical landholders will come forward with donations and offers to sell off market. So I've been surprised with just a few Facebook posts, word getting out and people contacting me with sites that they want to sell pre-market. So yeah, then trying to find the ones that marry up in terms of zoning and location. It's a challenge, but that is obviously the big point. And one of the hard things we're finding is just how much land councils have sold off and are now horribly embarrassed about. Yeah, it's really staggering to see how few councils actually have done land audits and how few, really know what land is held across all government agencies. Okay, I can see a few questions coming through in the chat here.
Yeah, thanks, Carl.
Michael Tibbs, keen to learn more about CLTs, but feel I don't know enough. At point of sale, is a market appraisal done, then the discount, say 30% applied? Yeah, it would be up to the trust to set the type of appraisal they would base their valuations on. Could be done via municipal ratings. That happens annually. You can get a property appraiser to come in. They cost around about $4,000 each. Some trusts, some intentional communities around Australia have sidestepped all that and gone with a builder they know and trust and have used his valuation there. So yeah, that is one of those questions that there'll be lots of meetings debating which way to go forward, I think. But yeah, the discount of say 30%, that again depends on the trust. They may well have the land donated. They may well have some blended finance organised so that they can they can perhaps offer the site at a cheaper rate, some 50% of market appraisal. There's also the other way to look at it at cost of construction plus land, which is what I dare say for the first purchaser you would look at. And yeah, that would be probably the best way forward on that question.
Right, there's two more in there for you, Carl, around the advantage of separating land from dwelling, and also where you got your data on the economic returns associated with CLTs.
Yeah, sure. So Kevin, thanks for the question. The advantage of separating land from the dwelling. Well, yeah, in many states in Australia, we can't formally do that. And fingers crossed tomorrow we get some pro bono legal advice with a big international law firm to help us sort of sort through that state by state on the latest developments. But here in Victoria, the Residential Tenancies Amendments of 2017 have allowed that. And if you think about a typical home purchase, the land component is somewhere between 60 to 70% of every purchase. So if you can pull that out of the borrowing requirements, that then means you've got a similar size discount on your mortgage deposit. And it's that deposit hurdle that locks so many people into rental for so long. You know, that 60, 80, 100K, that is the big thing that is that barrier to entry. So that's where these fraudulent help to buy sort of schemes are coming through, which are actually pushing prices up. But having that separation of land from housing gives the trust an advantage in a way in terms of distributing risk as well, because the resident has to take on some of the risk by borrowing for the home, whereas the trust manages the land in the long run. So yeah, I kind of looking forward to more insights on that. And the other question, I think, is from Rose. Where did I get that data from? You'll be able to see those community return, the return on investment on our new website, which should go live in another week. Can I get it up? Oh God. It's a recent report that's come out by Colacorn, I think, was the researcher. So yeah, I'll try and put that in the chat for you.
While I scout through some more of these questions, I'll ask my questions, which are around what's the one thing the government could do to support these alternative models, and maybe one thing that the private or traditional sector or the citizen sector can do to support innovation, to each of you.
Can you just repeat it again?
Something that the government can do and something that the private sector or citizen sector can do to support these alternative models and innovation.
Make the necessary money flow. I know that sounds really simple, but as I was just saying to someone in the chat, if you do anything out of the normal, then financiers won't give you any more than 70% of a loan on your value. So you get down to a 70% LVR. So you can't really afford to do anything without an exceedingly large deposit. So, you know, if in civil society, if we could be a bit nice and assist each other with some fairly decent returns on loans to fill that gap, then we can make these projects happen and show that they're not as risky as they're perceived to be, and show that, as you know, research has done in the US, that people who are engaged in the development of their own dwellings and choose to develop dwellings of a higher sustainability standard have a far lower default rate on their mortgages. They, you know, it's a safer loan for the lenders, yet we can't loan money from them to build things that are collective or collaborative or designed a bit out of the norm. So, you know, one thing I've always said to, you know, our co-op and mutual banks, support some cooperative housing. I mean, this is, you know, there's the ideas and the ideals are so well matched between those entities, yet, you know, they are forced through our government and prudential systems to carry such aversion to risk. So how do we do it? Well, we're currently giving, the government is giving away shared equity contributions and guarantees so that people don't have to pay mortgage insurance on properties up to $750,000. Yeah, where people who probably don't need that loan or that guarantee in some cases, but in many cases they do. We can't get those for building our own dwellings, for doing things like co-housing or doing things like a cooperative, even though ultimately it's lower risk. So it's this fact that the systems continue to support the status quo. What's entrenched is entrenched, and trying to do anything different, we need help from someone to do something a little bit different. Now, this is why with some of the questions in the chat, we often see innovative housing models occurring at the higher end. And Elena and I have discussed this in a lot of detail in the past, but we often see things that are nowhere near affordable occurring as innovations. Now, I encourage that, because if those people who've got the cash and are willing to take risk are able to demonstrate that it's not as risky as the funders and everyone thought, then other people will be able to step into that too. Then we'll be able to get loan to value ratios that are more able for people to access, etc. So in many ways, you want people with the money to take the risk first. So one thing, you know, interviewing a financier, they said to us once was, well, we don't want to be the bank who supported a low income group to do something and it fell apart. That publicity is going to shoot us. So they literally won't take that risk. So that's what they can do. Give us those guarantees on loans. Doesn't even cost money.
Yeah, that's important. Jasmine, one of the things coming out of America with CLTs now is that because they've got 50 years of history and this great data point through the GFC that foreclosure rates were 90% lower than the mainstream market, they're now being seen as low risk lending entities, even though they don't have the land there as security. So that's a huge win. And there's also advantages on lenders' loan mortgage insurance as well. So yeah, the data is coming our way and we just have to keep pushing.
Yeah. No, I think that to get data is really important actually to us to kind of prove that this is not a an unfinanceable model. But I think making land available, because I think land is a big issue, and in many local councils, I don't know how local councils think about this, but it's certainly an issue. Secondly, being careful to not make alternative housing models too administratively burdensome, because that's what we're seeing now in some of the rental co-ops, that they are under, because it's affordable housing, it becomes a regulatory sector, like a sector that's very regulated. And that, I think there's a tendency in Australia to make the poorest pay in the form of reporting every single dollar you use. And I think there's some, I don't know, you need to look at the bureaucracy around use of money and taking more risks, as Jasmine said. I think that's really important, and push the member-owned banks or the member-owned financial sector as well.
And for me, it would be dedicated community-led housing that covers CLTs, co-housing, tiny homes. It's ridiculous what we have to put up with. Wall Street got their build-to-rent legislation rushed through in 18 months, and I love this new term called balanced supply. We need a balanced supply between market-driven housing and affordable housing. And That sort of terminology should be pushed at every citizen with every meeting with our elected representatives. And I'd also like to see more community groups working on best practices. Basically, I met a woman up in Byron Bay who deposited $450,000 to a intentional community, never got a receipt. The charlatans took off with the money, and you know, making sure that before you get involved in an intentional community, there's some sort of guidance there for people. So that's what we're looking to develop with Grounded, is, you know, just some of these basics on getting a constitution established before you buy the land, and, you know, whatever housing model you're using, so that you don't end up having a fight over whether cats and dogs or wildlife corridors are the priority.
Great. Thanks, everyone. And thanks also for answering many of the questions in the chat feed as well. There's a few great questions in there that I think could be entire webinars just in and of themselves. So we'll certainly be looking at those to capture those headings for subsequent webinars or the Housing Week forums next year. Please, I'll bring it to a close now. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and also keep an eye out on the Humanitics page. If you're here, you probably know what's coming up, but I'll just drop the link in the chat again. For the rest of the sessions, we have an excellent session coming up tonight, a dialogue between Louise Crabtree-Hayes, who was mentioned by, I think, multiple speakers in today's session, in conversation with Michelle Maloney. So that will be an excellent chat, and I always get a lot out of their conversation. So hope to see you all there, or at another session later in the week. And definitely I'd like to invite you along to the session on Friday. We'll have a speaker from New Zealand talking about co-housing in more detail, and also a roundtable conversation to hopefully bring together a whole range of these suggestions and solutions into a strategic plan that NENA will be further developing in the new year. So thanks again to all of our speakers, and thanks so much to everyone coming along today, and we'll hopefully see you for the rest of the week.
And thank you, Elena, and the
Thank you.
Thank you, Elena.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.